Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this collective conversation. My name is Katerini Storeng, and I co-chair the Collective for Political Determinants of Health, which is organizing today's event. For those of you who don't know us, the Collective is dedicated to advancing research on how power constellations, institutions, interests, and ideological positions affect health within different political systems and cultures, and at different levels of governance. And today's event is with one of our members, Els Torreele, and is titled Reclaiming Medicines and Medical Innovation for Our Health and Futures. Now, Els will be introduced by today's chair, who is another collective member, Lauren Paremoer, who works at the Political Studies Department at the University of Cape Town, and is also an active member of the People's Health Movement, including its Global Steering Council, as a representative of its council. Her research focuses on health activism and global governance for health and political mobilization. And she's also the co-editor-in-chief of Globalization and Health. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Lauren, who will take us through today's webinar. And I hope that you all enjoy it and participate in the discussion after Elsa's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Katerini, and good day, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and to present Els to you, our speaker today. Els is the founding director of the think tank æqua, which focuses on equity and economic justice for health. She's a global health and medical innovation expert, working to rethink the global pharmaceutical R&D and manufacturing ecosystem to prioritize people's health needs and ensure equitable access to knowledge and technologies where and when needed. Els has more than 20 years of experience in scientific research, pharmaceutical R&D, policy analysis and research, and advocacy at Brussels University, Médecins Sans Frontières, Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, and Open Society Foundations. Since 2020, she's been an independent researcher and advisor. She's a visiting policy fellow at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, University College London, and a member of the WHO Technical Advisory Group on Vaccine Market Information for Access. She's also a recent Rockefeller Bellagio Center resident, an honorary science fellow at the VUB, and an author on over 50 international journal publications, including in The Lancet, BMJ, Nature, and Vaccines. Els is also a regular speaker at international conferences and a contributor to the societal debate around medical innovation and access through media and social media. So as you can see, we've got just the right person to speak to us today on the tension between creating public health for innovation and meeting health needs, and the other side of that tension, the idea of innovation and R&D as a way to generate profits, returns, and so on. Before I hand over to Els, just a few housekeeping rules. The event will be recorded for the first 30 minutes, after which the recording will be switched off. You can ask questions either by using the Q&A function or by using the raise hand function and asking your questions directly. And if you are interested in keeping up with events and activities at the Collective for the Political Determinants of Health, you can view our event page or otherwise sign up for our newsletters. And links to these will be included in the chat in just a minute. So with that, I'm happy to hand over to Els. Els, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for the generous introduction, and to the Collective, of course, for inviting me to present here. I'm going to share my screen, if that works. Yes. All right. I think you all see my first slides, correct? I assume so. So I'm going to jump in immediately and start with maybe stating the obvious, which is that medicines, vaccines, and diagnostics are not ordinary market commodities. Now, because they are actually part of the right to health, it is therefore a public and social and political responsibility to foster the availability through medical innovation and manufacturing of pharmaceuticals as part of the realization of the right to health. So it's not me who invents that, but this is a reality that sometimes we tend to forget. And that means also that availability means timely, equitable, and affordable access. It also follows that the purpose of actually doing the research and development, the medical innovation, and the development of pharmaceuticals must be to improve people's health and well-being. And you will say, well, of course, but as we will see later, that somehow tends to get lost. So given that, it means that for policymakers, the question is really like, what is the best way to organize, direct, finance, and govern the health innovation done at universities, with companies, etc., in order to supply pharmaceuticals. And I insist on that because we often hear that as if that is something that happens by itself, but it's really a political choice, a social contract, and a design of a number of policies and incentives that leads to the pharmaceutical R&D ecosystem and manufacturing ecosystem that we have today. And so it's really a question of how do we mobilize science for public health impact. And I give you, show you a few examples of more than 100 years ago, where actually initial scientific breakthroughs that were important for public health were actually really thought about as how to deliver health impact, whether that was penicillin, insulin, or the polio vaccine. These were developed by scientists and immediately thought about as how to deliver public health impact. But over the years, what we have seen is that the pharmaceutical R&D ecosystem has moved from what initially was a health motive and objective to increasingly a profit motive. And so if we see most of the past century, from the invention of penicillin in 1928, but throughout, I think, the 1950s and 70s, there's been a lot of scientific progress, and we often talk about the golden age of antibiotics and vaccines that have changed our public health, I mean, health of many people in the world. And most of those breakthroughs were actually quite widely available and affordable and contributing to major public health progress. This was not, this was also done sometimes by companies, but somehow there was this sense that this was to further public health. But then since the 1980s, and in particular the neoliberal shift we have seen in our global economy, there has been this idea that the initiative and the driving force can be actually left to the private sector. And it assumes, as many of those neoliberal dynamics that we have seen increasingly since the 1980s, that the markets can function as the most efficient allocator of resources, and that their private sector entrepreneurialism indeed is the best driver of innovation. Now, as we all know, what happens then if you leave it to the private sector, then the maximizing sales, revenue, and profit becomes the main driving force. And we have seen over the years, in the 90s, there was this initial concept of blockbusters, the first drugs that actually generated more than $1 billion sales were then heralded as something really new. Today, 1 billion is almost no longer worthwhile the investment, and it has moved to what are called niche busters that are actually similarly making a lot of profit for the company, but not by making drugs that are widely used like the blockbusters, but actually by selling products that are very expensive for a small number of people, but that also deliver a lot of profit. And increasingly to what is now called personalized medicine, where actually treatments are developed just for individual persons, and where the cost and price of that are going out of the roof. And what we know also that in the most recently, there is increasingly also the financialization of our whole economy, but also translated into the pharmaceutical industry. We had last month an interesting collective conversation about the financialization and the impacts. And in pharma, that is exactly the same. The revenues have been going up over the years, but very little of that gets invested in research and development and new health innovation, but most is actually extracted from the system, distributed to shareholders through share buybacks and invested in marketing to sell even more, but not really in that innovation ecosystem. Now, the whole assumption for letting the private sector drive pharmaceutical R&D has been that there is an assumption that there is this win-win situation, that it is possible to actually create both incentives to respond to the economic and financial imperatives of pharmaceutical companies and at the same time address health needs through medical innovation. And for that to do, we come back to the social contract. What we know is that there is investment of private capital and private know-how by the private sector, but that there are a whole set of policies and incentives, and including a lot of financing, that the public sector creates into this enabling environment to create this assumed win-win. But after a number of years of having seen what this delivers, I think that there is a growing realization that what we have actually is a growing misalignment, where the economic and financial interests of pharmaceutical companies weigh much more in that balance than the health needs and the expected objectives for medical innovation. And just to give you a few illustrations of that, I think you are all very familiar with the fact that increasingly medicines are far too expensive, even for wealthy health systems, let alone in the rest of the world. We also know of many unmet health needs for which no research and development is done. The threat of growing antibiotic resistance is one, but there are many health challenges that are primarily in the global south that are not addressed at all or not appropriately addressed. Now, in recent years, we hear more and more about the problem of stockouts, often of actually older and relatively cheap medicines for which the business case is not interesting enough for pharmaceutical companies to continue manufacturing, and then they drop out of the market, such that those medicines, even essential antibiotics, are no longer available. And a fourth element that I think is acknowledged is that when you look at the type of medical innovation that the companies are delivering, we see that actually the majority, more than half, sometimes even 60 or more % of the new medicines do not have any added therapeutic value compared to what we have already. So it's an enormously wasteful process where it seems more or as profitable to develop a drug for something that we actually already know how to cure than to really go for the medical breakthroughs. And then last but not least, very important for all of us, is that for the new products that are being developed, often there is a lack of equitable access globally, with, of course, the situation of the COVID vaccines, a very recent reminder. And as we will remember from those discussions during COVID, a very critical aspect in all of this is intellectual property rights, in particular patents. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. So what I want to focus on here is that we really have a misalignment also in the way we measure success between what pharmaceutical companies do and want to do, and so they are the driving force today, and what we would need for maximizing public health impact. And for instance, obviously companies and their shareholders will prioritize what is most profitable to develop, while what we need from a public health perspective is actually prioritizing unmet health needs, not having another drug of something that we already have a treatment or a vaccine for. Similarly, maximizing revenues via high pricing is, of course, in the interest of pharmaceutical companies, but not in the public interest, where we want affordable and equitable access. Similarly, what we want is companies to invest in actually needs-driven research and development with the goal of achieving breakthroughs, not more of the same. And often breakthroughs, that means you need to take some risks in your research and development. While for companies, they try to minimize the risk for R&D failure by exactly doing more of the same rather than really thinking out of the box and going for totally new ideas. And then, of course, we know already maximizing revenues can go through high prices, but also through increasing sales, through marketing, etc. While from a public health perspective, medicines is not just that you want to take them as much as possible. There is the concept of rational use of medicine, only using them when needed, in particular in the context of anti-infectives and antibiotics to avoid resistance, but also to avoid harm from side effects, because all drugs have side effects and you don't want to expose anyone when the benefit is not worth it. And so in the end, what we have is actually what I call, it's a misallocation of our innovative and productive capacities for health. And that is increasingly so with our financialized economy, where capital really controls what is developed and brought to market. And there is a beautiful study that was done a few years ago, commissioned by the Dutch government, trying to better understand the financial ecosystem of pharmaceutical R&D, in particular the early stages, like the whole venture capital and what gets actually into the pipeline and ultimately can be developed. And their conclusions were very clear. And this is a consultancy firm. It's not an activist report, but their conclusion was very clearly a drug's expected financial return is the main determinant of whether it will be developed or not. So that means that the existing capital, which today is mostly private capital, will flow to those technologies and companies that will deliver the highest financial return. And as Hai-Yun Chang once said, it's like the democracy, instead of the democracy or a health needs-driven system, you have $1, one vote on the priority setting in R&D. But it also means that our brightest minds and scientists are not usually working towards improving health, but actually serving capital. And there is, for me, a very strong example of that, where you see that the type of longevity research, the dream of living forever, is getting a lot of money from the tech billionaires from Silicon Valley, because they believe in this long-termism and other crazy ideas, where we have a lack of money in main areas of unmet health needs, such as antibiotics. But that is, again, when it's $1, one vote, where we go. And so a major tool for that capital, of course, to achieve that is because it is captured through intellectual property and patent monopolies on knowledge, on the products, on the technology platform. We have a whole set of issues all related to the so-called knowledge economy that is currently being captured through intellectual property. And I know that many of you are quite familiar with that, but I want to emphasize how new that is, in the sense that like land before, knowledge used to be a commons. It was something that was out there for the benefit of all, and a lot of knowledge generation was done at academics, in the public sector, etc., and just shared for the betterment of everything. And so the whole scientific progress has long been based on the idea of sharing, building upon, exchanging, etc. But then again, as part of the neoliberal privatization of our knowledge-based economy, basically, we have seen this intellectual property patents that actually serve to privatize the knowledge. There has been a famous Bayh-Dole Act in the US that, for the first time, allowed the products of publicly funded research in academia, and where in the US, the National Institutes of Health, NIH, is a really big funder so far, until Trump changes that maybe tomorrow. But that the result of that research could be privatized by taking out patents by the NIH or the academic the research universities, and then licensed out to the private sector. And it has also changed this idea that research is a collective effort to a winner-takes-it-all situation, because the one who has the patents and can actually extract that knowledge from the commons into the into private hands will own that end result, but everything that preceded kind of gets captured and extracted into that private asset as well. And then we have in 1995 the World Trade Organization's TRIPS agreement that basically globalized minimum standards on intellectual property throughout the whole world. And that has meant that we've all countries had to accept patents, including on pharmaceuticals, for at least 20 years. Now, patents, intellectual property rights, I want to emphasize, are neither a property nor a natural right, even though many would like us to believe that, and a lot of narrative is being built around that. But patents, intellectual property rights, have been created as a policy tool that is used by states, by governments, with a clear purpose of incentivizing innovation and, at the same time, disseminating the technology for the advancement of science and technology. And of course, there is the temporary monopoly that is being given, but it was always meant to be in exchange for disclosure to actually accelerate the development of research and knowledge. But in practice, that is clearly not what is being done. It's been much more used today as a private property right that creates monopolies that can be exploited. The part of the dissemination is much less developed. And so that's where I come from when I think about pharmaceutical patents. And it's like, is that actually an adequate policy tool for health? Because already it is a policy tool, but, and we'll come back to that, if the purpose is public health, I want to make the case that this is actually a completely wrongly designed tool. It's failing as an incentive for R&D to improve public health, as I've already shown, and it is also a barrier to the dissemination of technology, because the disclosure that is demanded by, in principle, law is not at all enforced, and so it's a joke. And what happened in practice is that it is increasingly used as a tool of control knowledge, and knowledge being a very valuable monetizable asset, including to maintain the north-south inequalities and dependencies in terms of availability of technology and knowledge. And I think this is an old cartoon, but that very well illustrates some of the biggest problems around patents. Now, when we think about patents as the core incentive for medical innovation, it is actually the one that drives the profit purpose versus the health purpose. And the reason is as following. If you think about what can be patented versus what brings therapeutic benefits to the patients, you see that those are completely different things. And in fact, if you see what can be patented, that is actually things that are chemically novel and inventive, whatever that may mean, and industrial applicability. But there is nothing in the definition of what is patentable that says that it needs to demonstrate therapeutic benefits, that it needs to address public health priorities, or that it needs to ensure access, affordability, and knowledge sharing, all the things that we from a public health community expect from pharmaceuticals. And so what we have is actually a system of incentives where the patents are tradable assets, monetizable in the stock markets, and are actually an asset for creating financial and economic value. But they are not designed to create public health value, because nothing in the definition of a patent speaks about that it should do anything for health. And that is really the main basis of why patents are completely unsuitable, not fit for purpose to drive medical innovation for health. And so, of course, we know that all the economic incentives today in that win-win supposed situation are focusing on the financial and economic value. And we don't have public health incentives that create, that drive the pharmaceutical ecosystem towards public health value. And that's why I think what we need is really a new value proposition and a new economic thinking around health for all, and in particular medical innovation. And as you may know, there has been a WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All, led by Mariana Mazzucato, who has done quite some work trying to unpack a little bit. If we say that health for all or medical innovation for access is the purpose, how can we create an ecosystem with policy incentives, industrial policy, etc., such that this is the result, the outcome, and that it focuses specifically on health. And I think what I have been doing a lot more of the last couple of years is also see how we can implement that, in particular working with researchers and developers in the global south, because we now have this unequitable system where health innovation is done in the global north, and in the global south, we need to do all kinds of efforts to achieve equitable access. But I think there is a lot of opportunities to do research and development in the global south, and that is also what they would like to do, but they need to have access to those technologies through technology sharing and access to a favorable ecosystem in their countries with the right policies to make that happen. Now, I think there has been some progress. It's not all doom today. There are different initiatives, whether it's in Brazil or Cuba or even in Europe, where there is a push towards much more public pharma for Europe, looking at how the public sector can reclaim the purpose of medical innovation, but it needs the freedom to operate, where currently patents are very much in the way to actually even develop certain technologies for public health, but there are efforts being done trying to reclaim indeed that space technologically to deliver public medical research and medical innovation for health and equitable access. So in conclusion, I think what we really need is to develop and design a new social contract. Remember, the supposed win-win, but really have the win on public health back up there. And it will require strong leadership from the public and also a direction to direct the current R&D priorities to address the health needs that are important. So I strongly believe that for that, we need to reclaim that actually knowledge and critical health technologies should be global commons, not privately held commodities. So we need to free the knowledge from this private enclosure for use to improve health and equity. And I think having seen what the pandemic created and other health pandemics or epidemics that we are still witnessing, we need to reclaim that openness such that we can actually do public health-driven research and have the control over that priorities. And maybe a health exemption at the WTO might be a way to go there. And then we need to also reshape the economic logic underpinning health innovation and looking at creating health value, so therapeutic benefits, rather than creating monetary value in our economic incentives. Focus on collective intelligence and collaboration rather than what we do now, proprietary competition and the winner takes it all, but actually really create that collective thinking again, as we have done and shown that it was possible again during COVID before it became privatized and monopolized. And then we need, of course, public financing for health, not just to promote economic growth and competitiveness with all kinds of incentives, but really frame it such that we can develop our health purpose. And so that brings me to that together means designing a new social contract for pharmaceutical innovation and equitable access that can comprise public and private sectors. It's not about doing everything by the public sector, but really shaping that ecosystem such that the goal is develop treatments, vaccines, health technologies to further global public health. And I think that will also require to reimagine some kind of public custodianship of the knowledge, our collective knowledge for the public interest, so that we can go back to sharing and building knowledge together and foster health needs-driven innovation altogether, rather than having that as a competitive, secretive activity. And with that, I thank you for your attention.